The house welcomed me with the scent of fried meat and the hum of voices I hadn't heard in 3 years, at least not continuously, not in person. 3 years spent in dust, gunfire, and frayed nerves. And now here I was, wooden floor beneath my feet, the warm glow of the living room lamp, and faces that were supposed to feel familiar. My parents, my brother, my wife, all gathered together like something out of a damn Christmas card. Except it wasn't Christmas yet, and I wasn't coming back with gifts, just 2 backpacks and a hollow look in my eyes. The contract was over. Brad Keller, retired captain, was home again. Freedom was a bitter thing. My mother was the first to embrace me, her hands trembling slightly, as if afraid I might crumble in her arms. My father clapped me on the shoulder, muttered something about being proud, though his gaze flickered off to the side. My brother, Dan, smirked with that familiar crooked grin of his and handed me a beer, cold, straight from the fridge. And then there was Laura. My Laura. She stood a little behind the others, her wheat-colored hair slightly tousled, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. When she hugged me, she held on tightly, but her fingers hesitated on my back, as if she wasn't sure where to place them. I told myself it was just nerves. 3 years is a long time, even with a couple of short visits home. People change. Dinner was loud, chaotic. Mom rattled on about the neighbors, Dad resurrected old stories, and Dan poured fuel on the fire with his usual jokes. Laura smiled, but her eyes kept drifting toward the phone lying face down on the table. I noticed how she pressed her lips together when Dan joked about how she wasn't exactly sitting around waiting for you all this time. Everyone laughed. I didn't. There was something off about her laugh. It hit my ears wrong, like a knife scraping glass. Too sharp, too quick to die out. Later, when we were alone in the living room, she watched me carefully, her voice softer than before, but tight, as though stretched too thin. Tired from the trip? She asked. The guests had left. My parents had gone to bed, and Dan had slammed a door somewhere in the hallway. Yeah, I muttered, watching her fingers fidget with the hem of her sweater. 3 years of war will do that. She nodded, but didn't meet my gaze. Instead, she stood up, murmured something about making tea, and disappeared into the kitchen. I stayed behind, listening to the wind outside, the way it battered the bare branches against the window. Late November, cold, damp, the time of year when contracts like mine end and you come back to a world that should be yours but somehow feels foreign. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I had only come downstairs for a glass of water, moving quietly out of habit, the way you do in places where every sound can get you killed. Laura was standing by the window, phone pressed to her ear, her back to me. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper, but the words dropped into the silence of the kitchen like stones into a well. He hasn't figured anything out yet, but we need to talk. Yes, I know. Soon. I froze. My pulse slammed into my ribs, hard and fast, like the recoil of a rifle. She turned then, her eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment, her fingers fumbled, almost dropping the phone. Her expression flickered, shock, then something else. Something guarded. And then, too quickly, she smiled. It was practiced, rehearsed, like an actor hitting a cue. Brad, were you sneaking up on me? She asked with a nervous laugh, slipping the phone into her pocket. That was supposed to be a surprise, you know. You weren't supposed to hear that. What surprise? My voice was calm, steady, but inside, something smoldered, acrid and bitter, like smoke curling from a fire that hadn't quite died. Oh, a party. For your homecoming. She shrugged as if that explained everything. I just wanted it to be perfect. I nodded, even smiled, though something deep inside me shifted, groaning under the weight of an unseen pressure. A surprise. Sure. But in her eyes, I didn't see excitement. I saw fear. And that was the first shot. Silent. Unnoticed. I didn't sleep that night. Laura lay beside me, her breathing steady, too steady, the kind of rhythm someone forces when they're pretending to be asleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying her words in my head. A surprise. A party. Maybe I was being paranoid? 3 years in places where every glance could be a scope and every word a trap doesn't just fade away. But her voice on the phone, that whisper, that paused before soon, it wouldn't let me go. It rang in my ears like a distant alarm, the kind you hear right before everything goes to hell. By morning, she was acting like nothing had happened, humming softly as she fried eggs, moving around the kitchen with ease, even kissing my cheek when I came downstairs. The eggs were too salty. She never oversalted them. I ate in silence, watching her move, noticing how her motions were just a little too sharp, as if she was trying to drown out the quiet with unnecessary movement. I didn't say anything. Let her think I bought into her surprise. "Are you staying home today?" she asked, her back still turned to me, her voice light but holding the slightest tremor. "Yeah, for now," I said, taking a sip of coffee. It was bitter, like the smile I gave her. "Need to unpack, get some rest." She nodded, too quickly. Then she grabbed her phone and muttered something about going to the store, said she needed to pick up groceries for dinner. She left without asking me what I wanted, without a second glance. The door shut behind her, and I was left alone in a house I'd spent 3 years calling my safe haven. But now, it felt more like a minefield. I hadn't planned on going through her things. Not at first. For a while, I just sat there, listening to the clock in the living room. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Like a countdown on a detonator. Then I stood, started walking around. Her purse was on the couch, casually tossed aside. She had taken her phone, but inside, there was a small notebook, worn, with creased edges. I flipped through it. Grocery list, milk, bread, chicken. And beneath it, written in small, careful handwriting, pressed close to the edge of the page, call D. After 8. D. Dan? Or someone else? I snapped the notebook shut, my grip tightening as something heavy settled in my chest. By evening, she came back with bags, a smile, and some chatter about how the cashier at the store had messed up her change. I nodded, pretending to listen, but my focus was on her hands. They trembled slightly as she unpacked the groceries. Almost unnoticeable, but I noticed. 3 years in the trenches teaches you to catch things like that. After dinner, she said she was tired and went up to bed. I stayed downstairs, sipping whiskey, watching the fire crackle in the fireplace. The house was quiet, the wind outside rustling dry leaves against the windows. I finished my drink and went down to the basement, just to check on my old storage boxes, the things I had left behind before deployment, just to make sure everything was still where I left it. And that's when I heard her again. She was in the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar. Her voice, low, whispering, just like the night before. I froze mid-step on the staircase, gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. "No, he hasn't asked anything yet." I told him it's a surprise, and he seems to believe it. But we need to be careful. He looks at me like he already knows. A pause. I could hear her pacing, bare feet tapping lightly against the tile floor. "Yes, I'll talk to him tomorrow. We have to decide what to do. He can't suspect anything." I stood there, breath locked in my chest, blood pounding in my ears like a hammer. She finished her call, and then I heard her exhale, soft, tired, almost guilty. Then the creak of the stairs as she made her way up to bed. I stepped into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and drank it down in one gulp. The glass trembled in my grip, the reflection in the window staring back at me, dark circles under my eyes, clenched jaw, the face of a man who had returned from one war only to find another waiting for him. And I knew then, this wasn't paranoia. This was real, bitter and sharp, like the coffee that morning. And I would find the truth, even if I had to tear this house apart brick by brick. The war had begun, and I wasn't going to lose. The morning smelled of rain and her perfume, sweet, with a hint of vanilla, a scent I once loved. Now it felt cloying, thick with the taste of lies she was feeding me. Laura came downstairs in her robe, hair swept into a careless bun, and smiled at me like nothing had happened. I nodded back, gripping my coffee mug as if it were a shield. She didn't notice how my fingers curled a little too tightly around the handle. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, pulling a plate from the cupboard. Her voice was light, casual, but I could still hear the echo of her whispers from last night. Whoever had been on the other end of that call had rattled her. And I was going to find out who. "Not really," I replied, watching her fuss with the toaster. "Got too used to bunks and sirens. It's too quiet here." She laughed, short and sharp. "Well, you'll have to get used to it again. You're home now." Home. The word hung between us like a cruel joke. I sipped my coffee, staring out the window as the rain streaked against the glass, blurring the outside world into a gray haze. Late November, the season when things die quietly, without a fuss. Like my trust in her. The day passed in a strange dance. Laura kept up the chatter, neighbors, weekend plans, the kind of meaningless talk that fills the spaces where real conversations should be. I nodded in the right places, responded when I had to, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I started noticing the small things. Her phone was always with her now, tucked in a pocket, in her hand, even when she went to the bathroom. She placed it face down every time, as if afraid it might betray her. And then there was Dan. He dropped by in the morning, claiming he needed to grab some tools from the garage. He smiled at me, clapped my shoulder like we were still blood, still brothers. but I caught the way his eyes flicked toward Laura when she turned away. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there, something too warm in that glance. "How's it going, Captain?" he asked, leaning against the doorway with that lazy grin of his. "Bored without orders yet?" "Not yet," I said, meeting his gaze. "But I'll find something to do." His smirk barely faltered. He nodded, said something about catching up later, and left, trailing the scent of cigarettes behind him. But the worst part wasn't his look. It was Laura's. She watched him leave, not obviously, not long, but long enough for me to notice. And I caught it, reflected in the glass door. That was when I decided it was time to start digging. When she went upstairs to shower, I took her bag. I won't pretend I'm proud of it, but war teaches you, if you don't check, someone else will check for you. The notebook was still there. The grocery list hadn't changed. But that one line, "Call D," after 8, now felt like a goddamn beacon. I dug deeper. In a side pocket, I found a crumpled receipt from a coffee shop in the next town over. The date, 3 weeks ago, when I was still thousands of miles away. 2 coffees. 2 croissants. Laura never went there alone. She never had before. I put everything back exactly as I found it and sat on the couch, staring at her phone resting on the table. It was silent now, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way, and I would be ready when it spoke. That evening, Dan showed up again. Said he was just dropping by for a drink, brought beer like it was nothing. Laura lit up too quickly, too easily, and I saw how her hand trembled when she set down the plate of snacks. We sat there, the three of us, Dan making jokes, Laura laughing, and me sitting in silence, feeling something rot beneath this picture-perfect moment. He left around 8. And as soon as the door clicked shut behind him, Laura checked her phone. "I'm going for a walk," I muttered, grabbing my jacket. She barely looked up. "Okay." I didn't go far. Just around the corner, into the shadows beneath the old oak tree. And I waited. 10 minutes later, she stepped onto the porch, phone pressed to her ear. The rain muffled her words, but I could see her face, tense, almost angry. She didn't talk long. Then she turned and went back inside. I came home soaked but burning inside. Burning like the bitter taste of that receipt in her purse. She met me in the hallway, asked where I'd been. I lied. Said I needed a cigarette. She nodded, pretending to believe me. Or maybe just pretending not to care. The cracks had started to show, and I was going to widen them. The rain hadn't stopped, turning the house into a cage, cold, damp, with hollow walls that held onto her secrets. Laura left in the morning, saying she was meeting up with a friend, some kid I barely remembered. I didn't argue. Let her think I was still blind. The further she walked away, the more space she left for me to dig. And I dug. I started with her closet. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to feel where she hid her shadows. Her clothes still smelled of vanilla, but beneath a stack of sweaters, I found a box, old, worn, with the logo of a jewelry store I didn't recognize. Inside was a delicate heart-shaped pendant. I had given her something just like it on our 3rd anniversary. But this one was different, thinner, and when I turned it over, I saw the engraving, a single letter, D. Dan? Or just a coincidence? My fist clenched around the metal, feeling its edges dig into my skin. Memory is a bitter thing. Then I turned to her laptop. The password hadn't changed, our wedding date. She hadn't even bothered to hide. Or maybe she thought I wouldn't check. I opened her browser history. Nothing obvious. Recipes, shopping, articles about how to cope with a husband returning from war. Funny. But in the trash folder, there was a draft, an unsent email. The recipient, Dan. "We need to be more careful." He looks at me like he knows something. I can't keep pretending. Dated 1 week ago. I read it 3 times, letting the words cut into me like a bayonet. I shut the laptop the moment I heard the key turn in the lock. Laura was back earlier than I expected, carrying grocery bags and a stretched-thin smile. She didn't notice me coming downstairs. Didn't ask what I had been doing. Just started putting things away, chattering about the weather. I watched her, and all I saw was a stranger wearing my wife's face. "Didn't stop by while you were out," I lied, watching her carefully. Her hand froze for a fraction of a second over a jar of coffee before she continued unpacking, as if nothing had happened. "Oh, what did you want?" Her voice was even, but I caught the way her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Just to talk." Said he misses family nights. She nodded, smiled. "Well, he's always been like that. Loves having everyone together." I said nothing. "Loves it, huh?" I wonder just how much. That night, I went to the garage. My old storage boxes were still there, covered in dust. but next to them was a box I didn't recognize. No labels, just plain cardboard, sealed with tape. I slid it open with my knife. Inside, a man's dress shirt. Not mine. Dan's size. And the scent, cigarettes and cologne, the same one I smelled on him yesterday. Beneath the shirt, a photograph. Laura and Dan, sitting in that cafe from the receipt. She was laughing, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at something that belongs to him. The date on the back, 3 months ago. I sank onto the cold concrete floor, the photo in my hands. The rain drummed against the roof, keeping pace with the pounding in my skull. It all fit. The whispers, the glances, that damn pendant. They weren't just crossing paths. They had built a life behind my back while I clawed through sand and blood just to stay alive. Love is a bitter thing. You give everything, and in return, you're left with nothing but an empty shell. I put everything back exactly as I found it. Laura couldn't know what I had uncovered. Not yet. Back in the house, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, downed it in one swallow. She sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled at me. I smiled back. But inside, there was nothing left but a plan. The cracks had become fractures, and I was going to tear them wide open. I didn't sleep. Laura breathed beside me, soft and steady, like a child unaware they'd been caught. But I lay there, staring into the darkness, replaying everything I had uncovered. The necklace with the D, the email draft, the shirt, the photograph. This wasn't just betrayal. It was an entire life they had built behind my back. 3 years I spent fighting for someone else's freedom, and they stole mine in return. Irony is a bitter thing. By morning, I was already up. I brewed my coffee, black, no sugar, the way I drank it before a fight. She came down later, still in her pajamas, stretching with a sleepy smile. I looked at her and saw not a wife, but an enemy. But I kept my face calm, controlled, the way I always had. She didn't notice anything. Or maybe she didn't want to. "You're quiet this morning," she said, pouring herself tea. "Everything okay?" "Just thinking," I replied, holding her gaze. "About how much things have changed." She hesitated for just a second before shrugging. "Well, 3 years is a long time. You'll adjust." Adjust? Like it was on me to fit into her lie. I nodded, took another sip of coffee, and made my first move. "Dan called yesterday," I said, lying easily. "He wants to have a family dinner. Says we should celebrate my homecoming." Her eyes flickered, just a fraction, but then she smiled. "That's a great idea. When?" "Tomorrow. Invite my parents. Let's make it like old times." She agreed too quickly. I watched her fingers tighten around her cup. She thought she still had control. Let her think that. The day passed in uneasy silence. She went to the store, but came back empty-handed, her cheeks pink from the cold air. I didn't ask where she had been. I already knew. And later, when she was in the shower, I checked her phone. A message from Dan. "Everything okay? He doesn't suspect anything?" Laura's response. "Not yet. But he's acting strange. We need to end this." End this? How fitting. I was the one planning to end it. The pieces kept clicking together. 3 months ago, the cafe photo. 6 months ago, she called me at the base, her voice shaking, telling me she missed me. A lie. A year ago, Dan wrote me a letter, saying everything was fine at home. Another lie. They hadn't just been sneaking around. They had been living behind my back while I counted down the days until I could come home. But the final blow was still ahead. I remembered a call. A year ago, the night before an operation. I had dialed home. Laura didn't answer. My father had picked up instead, saying she was in the shower, that everything was fine. I had asked about Dan. He was supposedly away on a work trip. My father had chuckled and said, "Don't worry, son. We've got everything under control." His voice had been too cheerful. Now I understood why. He had been lying. They had all been lying. Dan and Laura. That hurt, but I could almost expect it. But my parents? My mother, who cried when I left. My father, who taught me about loyalty. They had known. Maybe they had even helped. That burned hotter than anything else, searing into me like molten steel. Laura came out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel, smiling at me. I smiled back. But inside, all I felt was cold fury. Tomorrow was dinner. Tomorrow, they would all sit around the table, thinking I was still their blind, loyal soldier. But I wasn't blind anymore. I opened my box of evidence. The shirt, the photo, the necklace. I placed a printed copy of her unsent email on top. This was my arsenal. My war. They thought I knew nothing. They were wrong. The fracture was ready. and I was going to blow it wide open. The morning before the dinner was as gray as a concrete bunker. The rain had turned into wet snow, clinging to the windows before melting into dirty streaks. Laura busied herself in the kitchen, cooking as if it could somehow erase what I already knew. I sat with my coffee, watching her, thinking about how good she was at this performance. 3 years of deception that took talent. A bitter kind of talent. Mom and Dad will be here by 6, she said without turning around. Dan's coming too. Just like old times, huh? Yeah, I murmured, turning the mug in my hands. Just like old times. She didn't hear the venom in my voice. Or chose not to. I stood, told her I was going to the garage to check the car. But I had another objective, the final piece of the puzzle. My father's phone. He had left it here a couple of weeks ago when he stopped by to fix a leaking faucet. Laura had tossed it into a drawer in the hallway, and I knew it was still there. The passcode? My mother's birthday. Simple. Just like everything in their lives. I turned it on, scrolled through the call history. And there it was. A year ago, the night I had called from the base before my last operation. 3 missed calls from Laura, then an outgoing one to Dan's number. The timestamp? 5 minutes after my father told me, everything's fine, son. I checked the messages. Laura to my father, that same night, tell him I'm in the shower. He can't know Dan is here. His reply, I did. Don't worry. I shut off the phone, feeling everything inside me hardened to stone. They hadn't just known. They had covered for them. My father, the man who taught me about honor. My mother, who lit candles for me every Sunday while I was at war. They had watched as my life was stripped from me and played along. Why? Out of pity for Laura? Out of love for Dan? Or because I had been too far away to matter? I placed the phone back exactly as I had found it and returned inside. Laura was baking a pie, humming to herself. I looked at her and saw not a wife, but a parasite that had devoured everything I had. But now I knew she hadn't done it alone. My whole family was complicit. By 6, my parents arrived. My mother hugged me, her eyes moist, but the warmth didn't reach me. My father shook my hand firmly, mumbling something about the weather. Dan was the last to show up, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing his usual crooked grin. He clapped my shoulder. Glad to have you home, brother. Missed you. Me too, I said, holding his gaze. He didn't look away, but I saw it, the twitch in his lips, the flicker of unease in his eyes. Dinner started quietly. Laura ladled out the soup. My mother complimented her cooking. My father told an old fishing story. Dan cracked jokes. Laura laughed. They acted like nothing had changed. Like I was still the same Brad who had left 3 years ago, blind, trusting. But I wasn't him anymore. I remember calling before that last mission, I said suddenly, looking at my father. You told me Laura was in the shower. The spoon in his hand froze midair. My mother coughed lightly. Laura kept her eyes on her plate. Dan took a slow sip of wine. Yeah, probably, my father muttered. That was a long time ago. And Dan was on a work trip, right? I turned to my brother. He shrugged. Something like that. I was traveling a lot back then. That's strange, I said, my voice calm, deliberate. Because Laura texted you, asking Dad to lie to me. And Dad, you followed along. Silence dropped over the table like a slab of concrete. Laura went pale. My mother clenched her napkin. My father exhaled heavily but said nothing. Dan stared at me. And for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. What are you talking about, Brad? Laura's voice wavered, but she tried to hold her composure. I'm talking about the fact that you all lied to me, I said, standing up. And I know exactly why. The traitors sat before me. My blood. My family. And I was about to burn them all down. After I dropped the truth on the table, silence thickened like pre-dawn fog. They all stared at me. Laura with bloodless lips. Dan with his frozen smirk. My father with red patches creeping up his neck. My mother clutching the edge of the tablecloth like it could hold this crumbling world together. I didn't let them recover. I walked to the bedroom, grabbed the box, and returned. Let them think this was impulse. Let them believe they still had control. They didn't. I dumped everything onto the table, right into the soup, onto the pie, straight into the fragile illusion of a family they had built. Dan's shirt, the necklace with D, the coffee shop photo, the printed email draft. Laura gasped like I had struck her, but this was only the beginning. I looked at them, at their faces, and felt something inside me sharpen, cold and precise as a blade. What the hell is this, Brad? My father's voice was rough, but I saw him struggling to stay composed. I'm holding up a mirror, I said, tapping the photo. Here's where you all were while I was out there dying for you. Laura and Dan. And you too. I turned to my parents. You covered for them. Lied to my face. Brad, you don't understand. Laura's voice shook, her eyes darting to the others, searching for an escape. It's not what you think. Not what I think. I laughed, the sound bitter, sharp, like gunfire in an empty desert. You texted him, said I was acting strange, that you needed to end this. You were his necklace. You sat in cafes with him while I counted the days to come home. Don't lie to me anymore, Laura. You're terrible at it. Dan pushed back his chair, his fists tightening. Listen, brother, you're exhausted. You just got back, I get it. But don't make this into a, you fucked my wife. I cut him off, locking eyes with him. For 3 years. You took everything that was mine. You're no brother, Dan. You're a goddamn rat. He stepped toward me, but stopped when I raised a hand. Not to hit him. A warning. I wasn't going to fight. My revenge would be cleaner. My mother started sobbing quietly, dabbing at her face with a napkin. My father coughed, ready to say something, but I shut him down with a glare. And you too. I turned to them, voice cold, steady. You knew. Dad, you lied to me on the phone. Mom, you kept quiet. You chose them over me. Your son, the one who came back alive against all odds. My mother whispered, brokenly, we didn't want to hurt you. Her voice was weak, like the wet snow falling outside. You were so far away. Didn't want to hurt me? I let out another hollow laugh. You killed me. Every single one of you. I gathered the evidence back into the box, leaving them there, sitting in the wreckage of their lies and their soup-stained guilt. Then I walked out to the garage, shutting the door behind me. Among the dust and old tires, I sat down and opened my laptop. I had a plan, not just to expose them, to destroy them. First, Laura. I checked our bank accounts. Everything we owned, the house, the savings, the car, was under my name. She had been living off me while I fought through hell. I called my lawyer, an old army buddy. The divorce would be fast. She wouldn't get a dime. Not even the pie she had baked to keep up the illusion of being my wife. Next, Dan. He loved bragging about his new job at a construction firm. I knew his boss. We had crossed paths before. One call was all it would take to shatter his reputation. A cheater, a liar, a coward. No one would want a man like that on their team. His career would collapse like a house of cards. And my parents? I'd erase them. No calls. No visits. Let them live with their guilt and empty justifications. They had chosen their side. I shut the laptop, feeling my rage settle into something quieter, colder, satisfaction. Tomorrow, they would understand. I wasn't just a victim. I was a survivor, and I would make them pay. Dinner was dead, but I returned to the table. They were still sitting there like statues, frozen in their roles. Laura stared into nothing. Dan gripped his wine glass. My parents sat in silence, as if hoping that if they didn't speak, everything I had said would somehow disappear. I didn't give them that hope. I came back to burn their world down. I slammed the box of evidence onto the table with a crash that made my mother flinch. Soup splattered, stains spreading across the tablecloth like blood. Truth is a filthy thing. It stains everything it touches. You thought I wouldn't find out? I said, my voice shaking with the rage I no longer tried to contain. 3 years, I was out there, and you were here building your little fairy tale. Laura, you fucked him. I jabbed a finger at Dan, while I counted stars in the desert. Dan, you took what you wanted because you knew I was too far away to stop you. And you too. I turned to my parents. You lied to me so I wouldn't ruin your cozy little arrangement. You are all traitors. Laura shot up from her chair, the legs screeching against the floor. Brad, stop. You don't understand. It wasn't. It's not that simple. Not simple. I stepped toward her, and she instinctively stepped back. You texted him, saying I was acting strange, that you needed to end this. You wore his necklace, Laura. Here. I snatched it from the box and threw it onto the table. Explain to me how this isn't simple. She choked on her words, but nothing came out. Tears streamed down her face, but I felt nothing. No sympathy. Just fire. Dan pushed his chair back, his mouth tightening. Listen, brother, I never wanted. Don't you dare call me brother, I growled, and he took a step back. You fucked my wife. You looked me in the eye and lied. You didn't just want what was mine, Dan. You took it. My father cleared his throat and stood, trying to regain control. Brad, son, let's calm down. We can talk about this. Talk. I grabbed the photograph and shoved it in his face. Here's your daughter-in-law, and your golden son while I was in hell. You lied to me over the phone, Dad. Told me she was in the shower when she was with him. You knew. You all knew. And you chose them. My mother sobbed openly now, gripping her napkin like it could somehow hold her together. But I was a hurricane, and they deserved every second of this storm. I filed for divorce, Laura, I said, locking eyes with her. Tomorrow, my lawyer starts the process. You get nothing. No house. No money. No me. You're free to go to him, if he even wants you now. She collapsed back into her chair, her hands covering her face. Dan went pale, but I wasn't finished. Dan, your boss is getting a call in the morning. I've already spoken to him. A cheater, a liar, a coward. That's your legacy now. No job. No reputation. Enjoy it. His mouth opened, but I raised a hand. Shut up. You lost. I turned to my parents. And you're dead to me. No calls. No visits. You made your choice. Now live with it. I don't need a family like this. My father stepped forward, reaching out. Brad, son, please. Don't touch me. I shoved his hand away, my voice cracking into something raw. You're all strangers to me. I grabbed the box, turned, and walked toward the door. Laura called my name, but I didn't turn back. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the cold bit into my skin, but inside, I was burning. I got into my car, slammed the door, and drove off. Behind me, the house faded into the night, a dark, silent grave. They thought I would break, but I survived war, and I would survive this. The explosion had gone off. Now they could deal with the wreckage. I stopped at a motel 10 miles from home. The room smelled of damp walls and cheap deodorant, but I didn't care. I tossed my bag onto the bed, sat down, and stared at the wall. The silence after the explosion was deafening. A bitter thing, victory. It doesn't smell like triumph. It leaves the taste of ashes. In the morning, my lawyer called. The divorce was in motion. Laura had no way to contest it. Everything was in my name. The prenup was airtight. She would leave with only the things she came into the marriage with. A pile of clothes, some jewelry, and that damn necklace with D. If she even wanted it now. I told my lawyer to push the process through as quickly as possible. I wanted her name gone from my life like smoke from a gunshot. He promised to handle it. Next, I called Dan's boss. A short conversation, a few words about betrayal and deceit. The man listened, coughed, and muttered that he would take care of it. I knew what that meant. Dan was already a dead man walking. His career, reduced to rubble. My parents called 3 times. I didn't answer. On the 4th attempt, my mother sent a message. Brad, forgive us. We never meant for this to happen. Please talk to us. I deleted it without reading the rest. They had made their choice a year ago when they lied to me on the phone. Now they could live with the silence they had earned. I blocked their numbers. Erased them from my phone. From my mind. They no longer existed. I sat in that motel for 2 days, watching the snow fall outside. It drifted down in slow, lazy spirals, coating the earth in white, as if trying to bury everything I had left behind. But underneath that white, the dirt was still there. Laura, Dan, my parents. Their faces flickered in my mind like targets on a shooting range. I didn't regret my words, my actions, but something inside me ached. A dull, heavy throb, like an old wound sensing rain. On the 3rd day, I met with my lawyer. He slid the paperwork across the table. Laura had already signed, fast, without a fight. Her signature trembled, like her voice at that dinner. I signed beneath hers, steady, precise. The house was mine. The savings mine. She walked away with nothing. The lawyer hesitated before asking if I was sure. I nodded. I was sure. She lost everything, just like I had promised. Dan called that night. I answered. I wanted to hear him drown. His voice was rough, full of anger and something close to desperation. You destroyed my life, Brad, he said. Boss fired me today. Everyone knows. Are you happy? You destroyed your own life. I replied, cold as the snow outside. You wanted my wife, my family. Now you have nothing. Not even them. I loved her, he muttered. And you were gone. She was alone. She was mine. I cut him off. And you were my brother. You chose betrayal. Now live with it. I hung up. He didn't call again. I pictured him, jobless, ruined, empty-handed. He wanted my life, and instead, he got ruins. A psychological landmine, detonated perfectly. No blood, just destruction. On the 4th day, I returned home. The house was empty, cold. Laura had taken her things, but the scent of vanilla still lingered in the air. I opened the windows, letting the freezing wind rush in. Let it erase her from my life. Dan's things were gone too. She must have taken them with her. My parents hadn't come by. Good. I changed the locks. Deactivated their keycards. This house was mine. Only mine. I sat on the couch, poured myself a whiskey. The glass trembled slightly in my grip, but I drank anyway. The wreckage was everywhere. Not visible, but heavy. I had done what I came to do. Laura was nothing. Dan was a shadow. My parents were ghosts. But inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. Revenge was complete. Now all that was left was to keep living. Or at least pretend I could. I woke up in a house that no longer felt like home. The motel was behind me, but the emptiness had followed. Outside, the snow lay thick, muffling sound like cotton stuffed into my ears. I got up, brewed coffee, black, bitter, like my new life. Everything was done. Laura was gone. Dan was broken. My parents were erased. I had won. But victory didn't warm me. It burned, like frostbite creeping under the skin. The day stretched, slow and heavy. I wandered through the rooms, touching things that once belonged to us. Her traces were gone, but the memories clung like phantom pain in a severed limb. I sat at the table where I had detonated their world and stared at the empty chairs. They had sat here, lying to my face, and I had believed them. Now, only I remained. In silence. I poured whiskey, drank, poured again. The alcohol didn't wash away the taste of ashes in my mouth. I thought of Laura. Where was she now? With Dan? Or alone, empty-handed, clutching that necklace like a lifeline? I pictured Dan, jobless, disgraced, with nothing but her betrayal to keep him company. They deserved each other. And my parents? Sitting in their house, looking at old photos of us as a family, realizing they had lost both sons. Their choice. A storm of emotions churned in me. Anger, satisfaction, something hollow in between. I had made them as alone as they had left me. Laura lost her home, her future. Dan lost his job, his pride, his family. My parents lost their sons, their peace. They had all thought I would break, that I would come back from more shattered. But I had survived there, and I had survived this. I was stronger than all of them. But what now? I stood by the window, watching the snowfall. Endless, silent. I could leave, start fresh, erase them from my mind. Or I could stay, live in this house like a fortress, letting no one in again. I didn't know. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't know what came next. The war was over, but I was still a soldier with no mission. My phone vibrated on the table. An unknown number. I expected Laura, maybe Dan, another pathetic attempt at an excuse. But the voice was unfamiliar, low, rough around the edges. Brad Keller? Who's this? I frowned, gripping the phone. Mike Reynolds. 19th Battalion. You remember? My mind clicked. Mike. Tall, with a scar on his chin. We had shared a tent before that last op. A solid guy. Yeah, I remember. What's up? Heard you were back. Thought I'd stop by, have a drink for old times. How you holding up? I hesitated. Old times. Not these, where everything had burned, but those, where I had been alive. Come by, I said finally. Doors open. He showed up an hour later. We sat in the living room, whiskey between us, talking about the war. He didn't ask about my family, and I didn't offer. But his presence was like a breath of air in the smoke. I almost smiled when he reminded me how we had smuggled rum past the sergeant. Before he left, he studied my face. You good, Brad? You look like you've seen a ghost. I turned my glass, watching the amber liquid swirl. Maybe I have. He clapped my shoulder and walked out. And for the first time in a week, I felt something besides the void. Maybe life wasn't over yet. I moved to the fireplace, pulling out the cafe photo, the one of Laura and Dan. I tossed it into the flames. It curled, blackened, turned to nothing. I watched the ashes settle and thought, it's over. Time to move on. Then I saw the letter. It was wedged under the couch, half covered in dust. The envelope was old, my name scrawled in her handwriting. I tore it open, and the words hit like a sniper's bullet. Brad, I'm pregnant. It's not yours. I'm sorry. Dated 2 years ago. Signed, Laura. The ashes had barely settled. And already, another fire had begun.